Dr Wine Tesseur is a Marie Curie and Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at Dublin City University. She holds a Caroline Fellowship to work with the NGO GO on her project Translation as Empowerment, Translation as a Contributor to Human Rights in the Global South. Previously, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Reading on the AHRC-funded project, the Listening Zones of NGOs, Languages and Cultural Knowledge in Development Programs, which lasted from 2015 to 2018 and was led by Professor Hilary Foote of the University of Reading. So her doctoral work dealt with translation policies and practices in Amnesty International, which she completed at Aston University in 2015. Before I hand over to Wine, I would just like to note a couple of things. So after our speaker has finished her talk, we will open the floor to questions. You can post your questions at any time by using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screens. Following our speaker's talk, you can also ask your questions live. You can do so by using the raise hand feature, also available at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the raise hand feature during the talk, or we will be lowering the hands to minimize any disruption, so please use it following the talk. Yeah, you can always upvote each other's questions in the Q&A box, and that will give us an indication about a question's popularity. Following the talk, there will be a short survey, which all of you are kindly encouraged to take part in. It will help us a great deal in terms of planning our future events. So on this note, I hand over to Dr. Wine Tesseur. Thank you, Wine, and welcome to Cardiff, albeit virtually, and over to you.
Thank you. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. Let's see. So I hope that's coming up okay for everyone. So first of all, I want to thank Abdel and Cardiff for the invitation to speak in this seminar series. I've attended some of the previous talks, which I thought were excellent. So it's really a pleasure to be able to contribute to the series. So my topic for today is linguistic inclusion in international NGOs, multilingual challenges, and informal translators. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of all the previous research that I've been doing over the past 10 years and that Abdel has so kindly referred to. So that's a bit different from what was in the abstract if you have read it carefully. So I'll be drawing on the research I've done with Amnesty International as part of my PhD, where I looked at translation policies, and I worked with Amnesty in their offices in Madrid, in Paris, and in Antwerp. And then I'll be drawing also on the work that I've done as part of the Listening Zones of NGOs, led by Professor Hilary Foote at the University of Reading and Dr. Angela Crack at the University of Portsmouth in collaboration with INTRAC. In that work, we focused on 4 UK-based development NGOs, Tear Fund, Save the Children, Christian Aid, and Oxfam, and we looked at how these organizations use language and what the role is of cultural knowledge when they listen to the local communities they work with and local partners. We did also conduct some interviews with other NGOs and particularly partner organizations in Malawi, in Kyrgyzstan, and in Peru. And then lastly, I'll be drawing on the research that I've been doing recently with the Irish humanitarian NGO GO. So I've been working with GO since October last year, when I started going into their offices, so doing an ethnography and conducting interviews with staff. And this project is a continuation really of the Listening Zones project, where in the Listening Zones project, we found that development NGOs don't tend to consider language overtly when they're planning projects and in their monitoring and evaluation processes, for example, and in reporting. They often don't translate reports into local languages, for example. So this for me really raised questions around if NGOs claim that they are working inclusively, and if they claim that they are working in close collaboration and dialogue with local communities, then how do they do this, and what role does language play here, and how can local communities use translation as a tool to empower themselves to make information their own, and also to communicate to NGOs what is important to them. Sadly, some of the plans for that project were interrupted by COVID-19. So I had plans to go to Honduras to go and do field work, which I haven't been able to do. So most of the work has been focused on headquarters. And that's also why headquarters communication with country offices, let's say, but not so much communication with local communities. And so that's also why in my talk today, as you'll see, most of what I'll be talking about is the role of informal translators, by which I mean multilingual aid workers who happen to use their language skills at work. I'll mainly be focusing on communication between headquarters and country offices. I also wanted to signal that we have recently published some of, the work that we've done as part of the listening zones in a book published by Palgrave, Development NGOs and Languages, Listening Power and Inclusion. So it's not a translation study specific monograph, but if you're interested in this, it is out there. So before telling you more about multilingual aid workers, I wanted to say a little bit about how NGOs are structured and who they are working with, because I assume that many of you have a translation studies background, and it may not always be obvious exactly how NGOs conduct this work. So the international NGOs that I'm talking about, they tend to receive the largest part of their funding from international donors or governmental donors, like DFID in the UK, or like USAID, for example. And they then have local offices in a variety of countries where they are active, where they develop their development projects, or they provide humanitarian aid. And they do this either directly with local communities, or they work together with local organizations to work with those communities. So this type of visualization that I've put on the slide is usually what is called the aid chain, where money and communication as well can be seen as going from the top of the chain towards the bottom and then back up again. That's the idea. And language obviously is part of this, because the international NGOs that we've looked at are UK-based and Irish-based in my own work with GOAL and with Amnesty, Amnesty UK-based, sorry. So they've used English, they use English mainly as their key language. And obviously some translation needs to happen somewhere along the aid chain. So that can happen on the country level, where the language of communication will often switch to the national language and then into the local languages when working with communities. Now, this representation is a bit simplistic because it does depend on the organization. It depends on the specific country office that you're looking at. It can even depend on the specific team and depending on what language skills you have in that team. But that's to give you an idea of why translation is a topic we can consider when doing research, and why it's important to think about this, especially because of the way it's tied in with power relationships and funding as well. So why am I focusing on informal translation and interpreting for this talk? Well, to give you a bit more of how NGOs deal with translation and interpreting needs. It's important to emphasize that only a handful of international NGOs tend to have internal translation teams that are based in headquarters. So for example, Oxfam, Peer Fund and Save the Children, they each have a small translation team that consists of just a handful of staff members maximum in headquarters, and they function as a kind of translation agency. So they will receive translation requests from colleagues in headquarters, or sometimes from colleagues in country offices. And then they will ask freelancers to take care of this translation and sometimes also interpreting work. The focus tends to be on written translation in this team, and the focus is also on lingua franca. So it's usually translation from English into French, into Spanish, into Arabic, and so on. Many of these teams, or many, the few that there are, also have a written translation policy. So cyrff's team has a translation policy, Oxfam's team does as well. Save the Children has a language and translation policy. And these policies tend to discuss the sort of remit of what the team can offer, and also then has usually a statement on what are the core languages for the organization, such as the languages that I mentioned, French, Spanish, Arabic, and English. But so that means, if you think about the previous slide that I showed you, and communication taking place in local languages with local communities and in national languages, that there's more translation happening that is not covered by these policies or by these teams that are essential to make these projects work. And so this type of work is usually done by multilingual aid workers who happen to be multilingual, have usually not been recruited because of that, and are usually not paid to do this type of work. So it won't be in their job descriptions that they're asked to translate or to interpret, but they'll do it anyway. So over the years, the interviews that we've done in the Listening Zones project, in my own work, most recently with GOAL, and I've also interviewed a number of people from other NGOs such as Plan International. I've been asking these people who do this type of work about how they perceive their role and how they perceive their agency. So I wanted to share a bit of my findings with you today. And so the reason why I think this is important to reflect on and also to discuss with the people in working in NGOs is because this type of informal translation is really critical for NGOs to be able to achieve their goals and to be able to meet the sector standards that they've committed to. So for a lot of the NGOs, if you go on their websites and you look at their organizational values, they'll say things like, we believe in partnership, we believe in inclusive working relationships, and so on. And there are sector-wide standards, for example, the one I'm showing you here, which is the core humanitarian standard, which sets out 9 commitments related to quality and accountability that NGOs want to achieve. So the first one there is, for example, a humanitarian response should be appropriate and relevant. A humanitarian response should be effective and timely. It should strengthen local capacities and avoid negative effects. It should be based on communication, participation, and feedback. Complaints are welcomed and addressed, so that also implies that you can listen to different languages to understand what the complaints are. Humanitarian response is coordinated and complementary, so that means that different organizations who are providing humanitarian assistance coordinate their work. Humanitarian actors continuously learn and improve. And then number 8, staff are supported to do their job effectively and are treated fairly and equitably. And that's where I think some of the material that I'm presenting today is relevant. And then number 9, resources are managed and used responsibly for their intended purpose. So I think for all of these, we can make the argument that you will need effective translation and interpreting to be able to keep to those commitments. So that's why reflecting on translation is important. There we go. So the first thing I wanted to tell you a bit more about is a survey I've done in GOAL to give you a bit more of the wider context of who speaks which language in an international NGO and how people are using their language skills at work. So GOAL has its headquarters in Ireland, and it currently works in 13 or 14 different countries. Many of them have English as one of their official languages, but some have French, such as Haiti and Niger. They also work in Honduras, where Spanish is the key working language. And then they have a Syria response program where Arabic is important, and also Turkish, because they work in Turkey as well. So in the survey that we did, we wanted to get a better picture of who of the staff was using which languages at work. And it was the first opportunity to collect this information and to share it, because the organization had never really collected this data and asked about language skills. It was also a way to explore the use of any kind of translation tools that people might be using, such as Google Translate or online dictionaries, and to hear from colleagues if they needed any further support to meet their language challenges or to help them in their language work. And it was the very first step of the project, so I aim to sort of initiate the dialogue with staff on these topics, and then follow up with interviews, and then after that, normally there was the field work, but then that hasn't happened. So some of the things we found in this survey was that there was a very rich multilingual capacity. So we had 117 responses from different country offices. We did have the survey in 5 languages. About 50% of the answers were from people in headquarters, and 50% was from people based in various countries. So in total, we had people reporting language skills in 37 languages, although we know that there are definitely more. And 15 of those were being actively used at work. One of the things we found was that there wasn't a very good match always between the language capacity that was available. For example, there were a lot of European languages spoken in headquarters, but they weren't always necessary. For example, communication with country offices in French, in Spanish, and in Arabic. We also found that there was a really widespread use of machine translation like Google Translate. So 63% in headquarters said that they were using Google Translate or similar on a regular basis. And this went up to over 80% in French-speaking and Spanish-speaking countries. And another thing we found, and what interests me here, is that a lot of the staff were acting as translators or interpreters from time to time. I did want to emphasize that these results corroborate previous research that we've done as part of the listening zones, and from colleagues like Silke Roth has published an article on linguistic inequality in the international aid sector. So GOL is a fairly typical example of how language is dealt with. So if we think about these informal translators and interpreters, there were a lot of staff. If they had language skills in Spanish or in French, if they were in headquarters, for example, they would regularly use these skills on calls or on chats and emails with colleagues. It's also important to point out that colleagues in Niger and Haiti, for example, although the office work tended to be in French, French for the staff there is usually a second or even a third language. And I think that's something important to keep in mind with what I'm going to tell you later. And so within that group of informal translators and interpreters, there was a small minority of staff, so I mean about a handful, 5 or 6, that invested a large amount of time in doing translation and interpreting work. Mostly for communication between headquarters and country offices. And so they would do this type of work every day. They would translate documents, they would translate training materials, they would verify the accuracy of translations, they would do interpreting for colleagues on calls, or they would also do interpreting during trainings. For example, I witnessed a training at some point about compliance information that was being run in English with consecutive interpreting done by a colleague who wasn't trained as an interpreter, but who obviously knew all of the required terminology. So that's the kind of things that I'm talking about. So if I look at my interview transcripts and what these multilingual people that do a lot of translation and interpreting work have told me, it becomes obvious that for many of them, raising awareness of the challenges of multilingual communication and raising awareness that colleagues who don't have English as a native language, this is something that they find important. They often volunteer to translate or to interpret at work to help colleagues, so it's not that they're obliged to. Some of the ones that I spoke to, they happily do that and see that as a service to their colleagues in a way. But there were also several examples where colleagues were being volunteered and they spoke of carrying the burden of translation because they were multilingual. So I want to illustrate these points further by some of the things that people said to me in interviews. So this is a first example. This was a French speaker who was based in headquarters and who said that when she joined the organization, I found out that there was really a language barrier between headquarters and the field. When there is French, Spanish as well, they do interpret procedures and policies in their own ways, and then they do something that is not compliant. And in French, it's different. The French-speaking countries, it's more like a complete barrier. So they don't even read the procedure. It's a blockage, really. People, they say, oh, it's in English, and they are discouraged by English, you know. Now, this person, she had gone to give trainings in French-speaking countries and found out that actually it was really a big problem that some of the documents that the NGO provided were only available in English. So what she did in response to this is the first step was that she created a budget in her team in headquarters that could be used for translation of specific documents related to the work of the team. She started working with an external translation company through headquarters, and she also reviews their translations when they come in to make sure that the terminology that is used is accurate. She started translating all of her training material, all of the PowerPoints, all of the notes, and she started organizing training not just in English, but in French and in Spanish. And this is something I asked her about. I asked, is that something that they've asked you to do? And she said, no, I started doing it myself because I've noticed that people really need this. It's not enough to just do this in English. And she also raised the issue of language with senior management and insisted that more translations of documents would be made available. And she did this, she made the point to higher management from two perspectives, not just saying that, well, there is a language barrier there, it would help our colleagues if we have the material available in other languages, but she also raised this from a risk perspective. She said, it's a big risk. If you translate this way, or in this other way, saying things, then you say something completely to the contrary. I mean, it's really a big risk to have if the translation is not a good quality. There were other colleagues who also functioned as informal translators who raised similar points. In this case, she said, I think we should be consistent. If we want to operate in fields where other languages are used, we need to provide people with the tools when they have not sufficient knowledge. We cannot expect our local people to know English. It is just beyond expectations. We want them to have more money to manage better grants, etc. But in the end, what are we providing to them to try to really be successful? You know, for me, that's, yeah, I don't feel we provide them with sufficient tools to be successful, put frankly. So on this slide, I put activism with a question mark. And the reason I did that and that I've been thinking about this is because some of my research has been referred to by others as being part of the activist turn in translation studies, or I often get this question about why I'm not linking my research more closely to research that's been done by Mona Baker, for example, and others on organizations like Babel's and social movements where translation activists play an important role to try to trigger radical social change. And I think the reason I haven't done that is because I haven't really seen those strong arguments and that sort of radical action in the organizations that I've worked with. So if I had to put someone forward or put a group of people forward who have this sort of activist mentality towards translation, I think they would be some of the people that are in this group of informal translators and interpreters who are raising awareness within their organizations among their colleagues and with senior management about the importance of translation, to make sure that colleagues are included in the organization and to make sure that the organization, project participants and colleagues aren't exposed to risks because a translation might not be up to standard. There were other ways too in which some of the informal translators I spoke to raised awareness about potential language issues. So one of them was not about translation, but it was about native English speakers. So this person, who was not a native speaker of English, but would often she would often translate for colleagues and interpret for colleagues. She said, what I would say to my team colleague who is a native speaker is that she needs to speak slowly, and also to me as well. Sometimes she says something so fast that I couldn't understand, but not only through the phone or through Skype to colleagues in country, you need to speak slowly. And when you write emails, you need to be to the point and short and clear, not complicated phrases. And that was my first comment when she came, because she had this beautiful email that went beautifully written, but you need to know that people are busy and people are not native speakers. And so you need to, the purpose of an email is to get your message across. People need to know what you want from them. And so I said, yes, true. So in a way, you're like raising awareness of the language differences. And she responded, yes. And she was actually very happy to hear that feedback. And since then took it on board. And even today, she tried to call the people we work with, and they only spoke Turkish. So she had from Google Translate a sentence written down in Turkish to tell them, we've sent you an email, can you please reply? So she tried to read it in Turkish on the phone, but they couldn't understand her because of the accent, which my respondents thought was very funny. I thought this was a telling example though, because not only did this informal translator raise awareness of the challenges of working in English if you're not a native speaker, with native speakers, but she also got her colleague to try to speak in a different language that she didn't master, to open herself up for insecurity and for potential failure. And I think that's an important gesture if we're talking about creating inclusive organizations and working on an equal footing. There were other people though, other informal translators and interpreters that I spoke to that definitely wouldn't have spoken so strongly about the work that they were voluntarily doing. So for example, this is from an interview I was doing with someone who was often providing interpreting in meetings and in trainings for Spanish, who said, it's not something that I would do daily, you know. I have, for instance, in January, we had some programs in Latin America. So also the people who were leading those assessments in Latin America, their English was not strong. So just to make sure that people here in headquarters understood what was going on in that, I took part in the meeting just to make sure that things were understood. So I was trying to get this respondent to make a statement that was a bit clearer perhaps, or triggering, asking him to think further about the work that he was doing. So I said, that's quite an important role though, don't you think, that actually you're kind of the oil on the wheels, making sure the whole machine works. And he didn't really see it in that way. He said, well, it can be done by someone else, you know. It's because I speak Spanish because it's my language, but it's not part of my role, basically. It's not my function. It's not. I'm not the person that needs to translate. It's not in my job description, basically. Do you know what I mean? And he continued with saying that it's just something that he's happy to do to support colleagues. So this may have been part of saying, I'm not a trained interpreter. So often when as a researcher you speak to people, they think that you are there to kind of check the work that they're doing and if it's good enough quality. So perhaps this response was part of that, but it can also be that he really didn't think this was such a crucial element, and he was just, as in any other way, supporting his colleagues through the day. Other colleagues too, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, they would be volunteered to do this kind of informal translation or interpreting work rather than taking it on out of a personal conviction and because they really wanted to. So this person that we interviewed, for example, was based in headquarters but had done some work in the field and said about this. So often it was, if we were in the field and I had a colleague with me who was an English speaker, I would be the direct translator between the two. So I would be the first point of contact to either the mayor or the head of the village or the beneficiaries, and then translating back to the person. You're always carrying that burden of, am I actually? And I think you end up interpreting a lot when you're bilingual. So in sum, multilingual NGO workers, to my mind, they make multilingual communication work. They play an important role, not just in communicating with local communities, but also to ensure successful communication between those based in headquarters who are mostly English speaking and country office staff. Some of them are raising awareness of the challenges that other language speakers than English are faced with, but they don't always self-identify as activists. I also wanted to point out that many of them emphasized the sizable amount of time that translation and interpreting was taking up. And like I said, this wasn't part of their job description. So it was eating into the time available for other tasks. And I think this is an important aspect for NGOs and NGO management to consider, because very often the argument is put forward that we can't have more translation because it's too expensive. So this type of informal translation practice is often seen as a way to save money. But if you think about it, it's not really, because you're still paying for it through the people that you employ who are not able to do all of the regular work they should be doing. And in addition to that, as we've seen, there's also certain risks involved in relying on staff who have not been trained as translators or interpreters. So this is risk in terms of to the organization, but also to participants and to staff themselves. So while this might be two arguments that management teams might be able to digest a bit more easily, I think it's also really important to make the argument that language and translation should really be part of discussions on diversity and inclusion. And it's a really interesting time to have this type of discussions, because many NGOs at the moment are having difficult discussions about diversity and inclusion in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've also seen a lot of conversations taking place on decolonizing the language that is being used in the aid sector. But at the moment, I would say these discussions are still focused on English primarily. So there's some things there that further conversation can definitely take place there. Now, the final point that I wanted to end with, and that I feel is important, is to reflect a bit on what we can learn from this as researchers. And I'm saying that because I felt in the research that I've done with international NGOs, I felt that it's often very easy to criticize NGOs for not taking into account language more overtly when they're planning and doing their projects. But I think as someone who's worked mainly in an Anglophone context at UK universities and Irish universities, there's a lot of the working practices around language that I've seen in NGOs that are also applicable to myself as a researcher. So there's an important task, I think, for translation studies scholars to reflect on how we use English in our own research, what languages we speak, and how that affects the recruitment of participants in our projects, for example, how it affects who has access to the reporting that we do, and whether we should be considering reporting in other languages and in other formats, not just academic papers, but also other reports, short videos that share research results, and so on. And some of the steps I guess that I've taken as part of this project I'm currently doing with GOAL is that I've put aside a really large part of my budget for translation and interpreting. And I think very often we'll do that for the actual data collection, but it's not as straightforward to also do that for any reporting that you're going to do or earlier on in the project to make sure that your project website is translated, for example, and is accessible to other people as well who are speaking other languages. So to my mind, the only way to do this kind of research, because it's not easy to collaborate closely with NGOs as a researcher on this topic. And I think the only way to do it really is to also be really critical of your own practices and be open about that and leave from a place of humility and see what we ourselves can do better as researchers as well. And that's all I wanted to say. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Venna, for a fascinating talk. Just a virtual applause from all of us. I've actually got 4 questions via email, so if you don't mind, I'll start with these and then we will see if other questions come along. So the first 3 questions are from Carrie Botois. So the first one goes, your recent co-authored book, Development, NGOs and Languages, offers rich insight into this field. How might your research be useful to NGOs that are not international or those working outside of the development sphere? That is the first question. Yes,
thank you. So in terms of for organizations who are not working in the development sphere, I think very clearly the findings are also applicable to humanitarian work and even organizations who are working on human rights. And it's something that I've been interested in because I felt that even in my work with Amnesty, as a human rights organization, there was very little to maybe nothing being said about the fact that language is also part of the human rights agenda, and that wasn't really being fully considered. And I think those things are changing, and I know that Amnesty has a program on gender inclusive language, for example, but there are definitely things there to learn and that work across the board. And in terms of humanitarian work, we've obviously have the crisis translation project, the Interact project led by Sharon O'Brien, which has come up with very similar results to what we found, with probably the biggest difference being that, well, in a crisis there's a real sense of urgency. So that's probably the biggest challenge, but they've come up with similar findings of not really planning for translation and interpreting needs, for example. So there's similar changes there that can be applied. And as to organizations working in the UK context, I think there's definitely ideas about thinking of the language that the people that you work with think about, the language that they are speaking, and that this can be implemented in policies that organizations have on diversity and inclusion, and to think through what it means to them. So I think it's up to organizations to do that thinking work themselves and see what applies to them and what doesn't, but I definitely see a lot of things that would apply to them as well.
Thank you very much. And then the second question, what would be your top tip for remote or virtual research with international NGOs given the ongoing impact of COVID, particularly if using an ethnographic approach?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a really challenging one because it is really difficult and there's no straightforward answer. So like I said in my talk already, I haven't personally been able to do the ethnographic fieldwork that I had planned to do. Initially, when COVID broke out, I was still going to headquarters in Ireland every day, and I was interviewing colleagues. So in the first instance, I suspended all my interviews because of the pressure that colleagues were under to respond to COVID. And I've only started interviewing again many months later. So what I could do in the meantime was still attend all the virtual meetings that were going on and seeing how the organization was adapting to the current situation. So in a way, I've been lucky with that because I already had the connections and I haven't had to try to negotiate access in any kind of way, because I think that would be the biggest challenge. So if you're being confronted with this and you're doing your research or you're trying to adapt your research, I think it would be important to think about what sort of data is available and could you access without having to go through the difficult negotiations with an NGO to get access to more internal stuff. So you could look even at their use of social media, for example, or you could try to find internet fora where they are working with translators. I think there have been some people in crisis translation who've been doing similar work. But it is very difficult. I think you can definitely do interviews. You could try to organize sort of focus group discussions. But in my case, because the area I wanted to focus on was a remote area in Honduras with very little internet access. And because of the time pressure that colleagues were under, I've decided not to pursue that. I didn't think that that would be a good way to go about it.
Thank you very much. And the last question from Kari. What has surprised you the most during your work exploring translation and international NGOs?
Yeah, thank you. I think probably the fact that it stays, the role, the importance of translation and interpreting stays so much under the radar, but then when you speak to colleagues, especially those working in country, it's so obvious and everyone knows about it. So it's surprising in a way that still it's not really part of planning processes, it's not part of monitoring and evaluation. But I guess what surprised me as well, or what I wasn't expecting, is that I would become so reflective and critical of my own research practices. And I think that's been an important part as well of continuing the work that I've been doing with NGOs and to continue to maintain those relationships, because it's not so easy. And if you do want to change anything, and I think I am kind of a translation scholar activist in this, if you do want to change anything, I think it's important to try to maintain those relationships long term, because change takes time. So yeah, biggest surprise is what a low profile languages and translation have.
Thank you, Vina. I'll take a couple of questions from the Q&A box and then go back to the one received by email. So there is one by Newman Tai. Is the current technology capable of developing a concise universal translator? Also, is it good to pursue the usage of such tool?
Very good question. Well, let me first say that translation technology is really not my biggest strength, so I hope I'm not gonna say anything that's not applicable here. But I think translation technology like Google Translate is getting better and better for big languages like English, French, Spanish, and so on. And they are being used by staff, and I think in some cases it can be used as well if it's to translate informal emails and so on. To a certain extent, you can use them. But for other, what we call low resource languages, like languages that are being spoken by many of the local communities that NGOs work with, they are not available, or the quality is really not that good. So there are a lot of challenges there, which might change over time, because again, there are a lot of projects that are happening around this. But I also really feel from the work that we've done with the Listening Zones project, when we've spoken to people in Peru, in Malawi, and Kyrgyzstan, this is not just about language, it's really also about trust and about respect. And I personally feel that going to a community like that, imagine that it happens, imagine that you have a tool that works kind of okay, going there with your phone and putting a phone in people's faces that might speak, or you ask them to read or whatever, it doesn't really show that you're taking an interest in their lives and you're taking an interest in their culture and the realities that they live in. And that, I think, is a really important part, especially in development, if you're hoping to build long-term relationships with people, and to improve their lives in a way. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And another question from Molly. Do you think progress will/should take the form of increased language learning and multilingualism within NGOs, or an increased effort to partner with multilingual individuals in the field?
Is that question written somewhere? I'd like
it's in the Q&A box, the top one.
Okay.
Happy to read it again if.
Okay, so it's either language learning to partner with multilingual individuals in the field. I think it should be both, to be honest, because it's important to work with people, and this is part of the whole international NGO setup, the problem, I think. It's important to work with people who are living in that reality and who are part of the cultures in the countries where you are trying to do work. But also, I think if you're trying to learn a language, it makes you more appreciative of how difficult it is to communicate in another language, and it automatically will make you learn more as well about the related culture to that. And I think that's something that's really important as well for NGO staff.
Thank you, Verna. So a question from Loredana, which has been upvoted. So as a translation activist, which have been the most effective arguments in sensitizing organizations to the importance of translation, as opposed to, for instance, just relying on English as a lingua franca?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess I've kind of touched on that in my talk. So I found personally, especially in my more recent work, that arguments around risk work really well. The risk, as we've heard in the presentation, the risk of, if you're counting on people to be able to interpret certain documents that are around compliance, procedures that NGOs are supposed to follow, and actually their English isn't really good enough to do that, there's a really big risk there. But what I found interesting, I think, over the last few months, is that you do see those conversations around diversity and inclusion that touch on language starting to take place. And there's one NGO, and I'm not going to name them because I'm not sure I could, but there's one NGO that has contacted me saying, we are reviewing our diversity and inclusion approach. We want to implement a language policy, and we want to make sure that it relates to principles of inclusion. And another NGO as well has contacted me for a workshop to talk about language as part of their Black Lives Matter steering group. So there is a momentum here, a specific moment in time, I think, that as researchers working in this area, that we can use to put those arguments further forward more strongly, that this is not just a matter of money, it's not just a matter of risk, it's a matter of respect and truly working according to your principles of diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Verna, and thank you, Loredana, for the question. So another one from Tatiana. Hello, and thank you for the presentation. What about, I think it's organizations as Translators Without Borders. Do you know or think that they could have an impact on this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess I always expect to get this kind of question and kind of fear it, because in translation studies, the position of Translators Without Borders has often been questioned because of the way that they work with volunteers and the fact that they don't pay their volunteers, but other management members are being paid. Now, from my personal point of view, leaving that specific aspect of volunteering aside, I think they are doing a really important job in the NGO sector by raising awareness of the issues of languages and translation. And a lot of colleagues that I speak to, they know Translators Without Borders. They have built a really strong reputation for themselves And they have also done quite a lot of research themselves, looking at their own practices as well of collecting data and what role language plays in that. So I do think that they are having an impact in the sector. Whether it's enough, I don't know, but it's a start at least, and it's a start that was really necessary.
Thank you, Venna. I'll take the question from the email and then come back to this. So it's from Ahmed Salhi, and he says, what brought your interest into researching NGOs and their relationship to languages? Also, what would be your advice to someone who wants to work on this area of research, but worried about the political implications of this type of research on their safety, given where they live?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. My interest, I think it was a sort of accidental interest, which doesn't sound like it's the right answer at all, but it's the truth. So in my PhD, my PhD was part of a bigger project, and I had to do what was called secondment, or a type of placement with other organizations. And it was coincidentally that I started working with Amnesty, and that's when I started getting intrigued about how they were dealing with translation. And I was working in the office in Antwerp, where at first they said, we don't really see what you could do for us because we don't have translations, we don't translate. Until I found out they were working with a team of 80 volunteer translators for some of the urgent actions that they were translating. And then that led to a lot more questions. And then I heard that the Amnesty had recently set up a language resource center, and that got the ball rolling. So yeah, that's sort of how it started. In terms of the other question about researcher safety, I assume that's a really good question. And again, it sort of emphasizes my own privilege as a researcher who's been working mainly in the UK and in Ireland. And for the research that I've done in Kyrgyzstan, I've been asked this question as well, but the political situation there is quite stable, and NGOs are not, well, they are a bit under suspicion there, because like under the influence of Russia, where NGOs are seen as suspicious Western entities. But I haven't really had to deal with that. So I think the best answer to that question is, you know your situation best. So speak to colleagues and read, because there is research out there. There are publications out there by researchers who have done ethnographic research, who have worked closely with researchers in these difficult situations. And on the basis of that, you can take your decisions, which, for example, you'll have to think about, do you want to overtly associate with an NGO? Is that going to make things safer, or is that going to make things unsafe in your case, in your specific situation? So there's a lot to consider, but I think there's a lot of material out there that can help you in tackling those issues.
Thank you very much. So another question from Raphael. He says, where do you draw the line between language policies and translation policies in the context of NGO translation and multilingual communication? How much institutional, in contrast to personal reflection on translation, could you find in the NGOs?
Really good question. How much reflection could we find? Not so much. As to that specific question, the difference between language and translation policy, so I've said something about that in the talk. I said that Tearfund and Oxfam have a translation policy, while Save the Children has a language and translation policy. And I've said that because that's basically what's written on these documents. So in this case, because policy often has a broad definition and it can be a bit unclear what we're talking about. So in this case, I'm really talking about the management document that has a statement on what the core languages of the organization are and what sort of services the internal translation team covers. In terms of content, I don't really think that those two, language and translation policy were really that different in that case. In terms of institutional reflection, we found some really interesting material from Oxfam and the history of Oxfam and how they've dealt with language challenges over the years. And these discussions go back at least until the 1980s. And in other NGOs as well, the sort of impression that I get is that these discussions start to take place once the organization has started to expand and grow a lot, and they feel that translation and language needs are growing internally, and therefore we need something else than an ad hoc approach. We need something that is more strategic and comprehensive. And that's when you get the discussion. But so the discussions very often take place in the context of avoiding duplication of work, avoiding wasting resources, maximizing organizational growth, maximizing communication to different people who speak different languages, sort of part of branding mechanisms of NGOs, if you want. But they make less reference to issues like diversity and inclusion. So it will be interesting to see how this develops as part of the sort of momentum that I was describing earlier.
Thank you, Venna. So another question from Maria. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I would also like to ask a question concerning data retrieval. Have you ever encountered any difficulties in approaching the institutions or NGOs for research purposes?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. It's not easy. You have to consider really carefully if you're going to try to approach an NGO, what's in it for them as well. And I think because NGOs are under a lot of criticism as to international NGOs as to what is their purpose and how are they using funding and so on, they are in a very vulnerable position in terms of Daily Mail sort of scandals as well. So you have to consider really carefully what they are going to get out of it. And you also, what I've done with all of them as well is we've had, in my PhD, I mean, and with Go, we had an agreement on paper beforehand of what data I would be allowed to use, what types of data, and where I would, we also have an agreement of when I want to publish something, they get time to review it and give me feedback, for example. But I find it's a difficult balance between being an independent researcher and saying what you want to say, and at the same time preserving the relationships that you're establishing, being truthful and honest, but without in any way sort of putting NGOs and the ones that you're working with specifically in a difficult position. So there's a lot of time and effort that goes into this, but it's not impossible.
Thank you once again, Vinna. So a follow-up question from Raphael. He says, thank you for your answers. Looking at the historical development of how NGOs deal with languages and translation, formalization of translation policy, as you mentioned, concerning Oxfam, sound really interesting. I think more of a comment than that.
Yeah, well, that's something that we've been doing, and specifically the case of Oxfam, Hilary Footed has published a paper, it wasn't on translation policy, but a bit more on how the approach of listening and listening in different languages developed over the years. And that specifically what Raphael mentions there, this historical perspective of why the formation of translation policy came about is something that I'm currently working on, actually. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Vinna. I think, oh, there is another question. Okay. So thank you for an interesting, it's from Clara. Thank you for an interesting sharing. You mentioned the challenges of undertaking ethnographic fieldwork during the pandemic. Do you have anything to suggest to the researchers who do not have prior contacts and are thinking about conducting this kind of research? Also, you mentioned the use of social media. What's your view on conducting digital ethnography from scratch?
Oh, that's a really tricky question. I don't think I know quite enough about those methods to give a specific answer on that. But I think it's a good time to explore all these different types of research methods now. We're definitely at a time where we need to renew ourselves and find new ways of doing research. And the other thing, there was something else I wanted to say. What was it? Well, it's mainly the same thing as I've said before. I think doing ethnography might not automatically be the best approach. And there's one colleague of mine at Dublin City University as well who had ethnographic fieldwork planned as part of their research, and they've changed it into interviews online because it was just not possible. So I think it's about thinking about your project and reconsidering what it is you want to get out of it and what other ways that there might be, of other methods you might be able to use to get those answers.
Thank you, Vanna. I believe we do not have any further questions, so I'm happy to end it here. So let me just share my screen once again. I hope you can see this. So very warm virtual applause from all of us. Thank you very much to you, Vanna. It's been really interesting talk.
Thank you.
And people are congratulating you for the presentation in the chat as well. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. It has been a pleasure having you, and hopefully you would be able to join us in one or more of our upcoming research seminars. And thank you once again, Vanna. Just double checking that there are no further questions. No further questions. Well, thank you very much, Vanna, and enjoy the rest of your day. And to all of you who have joined us, enjoy the rest of your day.